There's an owner out there with a 2016 F-150 running the 2.7 EcoBoost, and right now his truck is 6,000 miles away from 300,000 on nothing but standard factory schedule maintenance. No engine rebuild, no turbo replacement, just discipline. On the other hand, plenty of people have thrown a cylinder head at 100,000 miles because they never knew about one single issue that would have cost less than $50 to prevent. The EcoBoost has a reputation, an unfairly bad one in some circles, thanks to its early production years. But the truth is, this small turbocharged V6 engine, when maintained properly, is capable of surviving just as long as the legendary 5.0 V8, arguably longer per mile of fuel burned. In this video, we're going through every single factor that determines whether your EcoBoost sees 300,000 miles or ends up in the shop at 100,000. Stick around to the end. The last section covers one driving habit that mechanics say does more damage than everything else on this list combined. Before we get into it, I want to be upfront with you. There's no single trick, no magic additive, no one thing that guarantees 300,000 miles. It's a combination of smaller habits that add up over years. The EcoBoost family has been in the F-150 since 2011 in two main displacements, 2.7 litres and 3.5 litres, and both have gone through significant redesigns. That means some of the advice in this video applies a little differently depending on which model year and which generation of engine you have. So let's clear that up right at the start. Which EcoBoost do you have? The first thing you need to know before doing anything else is exactly which engine you have, because the recommendations differ. 2.7 litre EcoBoost V6, first generation, 2015 to 2017. This is the engine with the most well-documented factory issues. Engines built between April 2016 and January 2017 had a defect in the cylinder head valve guides, allowing oil to leak into the combustion chamber and burn off along with the fuel. The symptom is blue smoke from the exhaust and oil consumption as high as a quart every 3,000 miles, which is far above normal for a modern engine. If your engine falls into that narrow production window and you notice this symptom, that's your cue to get to a dealer right away and check whether it's covered under extended warranty. 2.7 litre second generation, 2018 and later. Ford revised the gaskets, improved cooling components, and strengthened the timing chain hardware. This is a noticeably more reliable engine. 3.5 litre EcoBoost V6, first generation, 2011 to 2016. The biggest known issue here is intercooler condensation, mostly on 2011 and 2012 model years. Moisture collects in the charge air cooling pipe after the turbochargers, and under hard acceleration it can get pulled into the engine as a slug of water instead of air, causing the engine to stumble. There were also frequent calibration issues with transmission shifting and ignition timing, which were largely resolved through software updates at dealerships over the years. 3.5 litre second generation, 2017 and later. This is a major turning point. Ford added what's called dual fuel injection, a combination of direct injection and port injection, new turbochargers with a turbine wheel made from a heat-resistant superalloy, and an electronically actuated wastegate. This is, in the opinion of most independent mechanics, the most mature and most reliable EcoBoost to date. Keep this part in mind because we'll need it later when we talk about carbon buildup. That's where the difference between generations shows up the most. Oil, the most important factor. If you remember only one thing from this video, make it this. Turbocharged engines live and die by oil quality and how consistently you change it. This matters even more than on a naturally aspirated engine for one specific reason we're about to get into. The factory interval and why you should ignore it. Your F-150 has an Intelligent Oil Life Monitor, or IOLM, which calculates when to change the oil based on your driving style, and that interval can stretch out to 10,000 miles or a full year. Officially, Ford stands behind this recommendation under so-called normal driving conditions. The problem is that very few people actually drive under those normal conditions, and the EcoBoost has a specific issue that makes that extended interval risky: fuel dilution in the oil. In direct injected turbo engines, especially the 2.7 EcoBoost, fuel is injected straight into the cylinder under high pressure. Some of that fuel, particularly during short trips and cold weather when the engine doesn't get warm enough to burn it off completely, washes down the cylinder walls and ends up in the crankcase, mixing with the oil. This is called fuel dilution. How do you spot this happening to you? The oil starts smelling noticeably like gasoline. Over time, you may also notice the oil level on the dipstick rising slightly between changes, which sounds backwards since you'd expect it to drop from consumption, but instead it's being topped off by fuel mixing in. Why is this dangerous? Diluted oil loses viscosity, it gets thinner than it's supposed to be, and it loses its ability to lubricate under pressure. This hits the turbocharger bearings the hardest, since they spin at over 100,000 revolutions per minute and depend on a perfect oil film to avoid metal-to-metal contact. Ford partially addressed this with the second generation 2.7 engine by revising the injection calibration, but it didn't eliminate the problem entirely. A realistic interval instead of the factory one. Because of this, experienced EcoBoost owners and independent mechanics generally agree 5,000 miles is a realistic ceiling for oil changes, regardless of what the monitor says. If you live in a colder climate and mostly drive short trips to work around town, bring that down to 4,000 miles. If you tow a trailer or do a lot of highway driving, the engine runs warmer more consistently and dilution is less pronounced, so you can lean toward the upper end. What oil to use? Use nothing but full synthetic 5W30, matched exactly to the factory specification for your engine. Don't cut corners here. The price difference between a cheap synthetic and a quality one is maybe $20 per change, but the difference in turbo bearing protection is enormous. Here's some perspective. If you change oil every 5,000 miles instead of every 10,000, that's roughly double the oil changes over the vehicle's life, say 60 instead of 30. At $70 to $100 per change, that's an extra $2,000 to $3,000 over the truck's lifetime. Replacing a single turbocharger on an EcoBoost runs between $1,000 and $2,000 per turbo, and you have two of them. The math speaks for itself. Turbochargers. The EcoBoost uses two smaller turbochargers instead of one big one, which gives you better throttle response, but it also means you've got two sets of bearings and two wastegate mechanisms that can fail. Warming up and cooling down the engine. This is free advice that most people ignore. When you start a cold engine, don't immediately load the turbos with full throttle. Give the engine a minute or two of gentle driving so oil reaches every component and lubricates the turbo bearings before you ask for full power. Even more important, when you finish a hard drive, especially after towing or a long highway run, don't shut the engine off immediately. Turbochargers run at temperatures above 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. If you kill the engine abruptly, the oil sitting in the turbo bearings at that moment stays there and literally cooks from residual heat, forming deposits that shorten bearing life over time. Your F-150 actually has built-in protection for this, a system that keeps coolant circulating through the turbochargers even after the engine shuts off, under certain conditions. But an extra 30 seconds of idling before shutdown after a hard drive still makes a difference. Known fitting and wastegate issues. The fittings connecting the oil and air lines on Ford's turbochargers are known to fail and leak over time. This isn't exclusive to the 2.7, it's a general trait of Ford's turbo systems. The wastegate valve, which regulates boost pressure, occasionally causes problems, but that's a relatively rare failure point compared to the number of vehicles on the road. If you notice a whistling sound, a loss of power, or a burning smell from the engine bay, that's your signal to get it diagnosed immediately. Ignoring a small oil leak from the turbo system quickly turns into a major failure. Carbon buildup on the intake valves. This is probably the most talked about EcoBoost issue on the forums, and it's worth explaining exactly why it happens. Why it happens. Direct injection engines spray fuel straight into the combustion chamber rather than into the intake manifold ahead of the valves, like older port-injected engines did. That means fuel never physically passes over the backside of the intake valves to wash them off. Over time, oil vapor from the crankcase ventilation system sticks to those valves and hardens into carbon deposits. Many owners notice symptoms: rough idle, loss of power, occasional engine hesitation, somewhere between 40 and 60,000 miles on engines with pure direct injection. The difference between generations. This is where it pays off. Remember the earlier breakdown by generation. Starting around the 2017 to 2018 model years, Ford introduced dual fuel injection on the second generation of both the 2.7 and 3.5 EcoBoost, a combination of direct injection and traditional port injection into the intake manifold. Independent teardowns, including a well-known head-off engine comparison from the Ford Tech Maculoco YouTube channel, showed a clear difference. A first-generation engine with 100,000 miles had dramatic carbon buildup on the valves, while a second-generation engine with dual injection at similar mileage had noticeably less buildup, with estimates suggesting the second generation can go roughly 200,000 miles before a physical cleaning becomes necessary. This doesn't mean the problem is completely solved, just slowed down, since port injection mostly kicks in at idle and light load, while direct injection still dominates at higher speeds and higher loads. What you can do about it. If you have a first generation engine without port injection, prevention is limited, but there are a few things that help. First, use a well-known quality fuel brand carrying the top tier detergent designation. This helps reduce deposit formation throughout the fuel system, though it won't reach the backside of the valves on a pure direct injection engine since gasoline never physically gets there. Second, drive the engine under load occasionally, not just light city driving for the vehicle's entire life. Brief, controlled highway acceleration now and then helps combustion run more completely and reduces buildup in the crankcase ventilation system. Third, if you notice rough running symptoms around 40 to 60,000 miles, a physical intake cleaning, removing the intake manifold and manually cleaning the valves, is the only reliable fix. Chemical additives run through the intake system can help a little, but they can't substitute for physical cleaning once deposits have hardened. Cooling system and timing chain. Coolant. Ford's recommendation for the EcoBoost is the orange OAT type coolant. Never mix it with the older green conventional coolant, since mixing different formulations can create deposits that clog the narrow passages in the cylinder head, where a turbo engine generates significantly more heat than a naturally aspirated engine of the same displacement. The first coolant change is recommended at 100,000 miles, then every 50,000 miles or 5 years after that. This isn't the place to cut corners or delay. A turbo engine that overheats, even briefly, can permanently damage head gaskets and lead to oil leaking into the cooling system or vice versa. Timing chain. The EcoBoost uses a timing chain, not a belt. Good news in theory, since a chain is designed to last the engine's entire life without replacement. However, there's a direct link to what we already covered. Diluted oil from fuel contamination accelerates timing chain stretch over time because the chain depends on proper lubrication of the tensioner that keeps it taut. This is yet another reason why sticking to 5,000 mile oil changes instead of 10,000 is directly tied to the longevity of the timing chain, not just the turbochargers. If you hear a metallic rattling or clattering sound from the top of the engine, especially on a cold start, that's a sign that timing chain or tensioner is starting to wear. Don't ignore it, because a jumped timing chain on this high pressure DOHC design always means piston to valve contact. In other words, a completely destroyed engine. Spark plugs, filters, transmission. These are less dramatic items, but they add up. Spark plugs. Motorcraft Iridium spark plugs, specific to your engine model, are rated for 60,000 miles. Don't delay this replacement. Misfires under boost put extra strain on both the turbochargers and the catalytic converters, which means a cheap part costing a few dozen dollars, if neglected, can indirectly wreck much more expensive components. Air filter. Replace every 30,000 miles under normal conditions, or every 15,000 if you frequently drive on gravel, dirt roads, or construction sites. Check it visually at every oil change. It costs nothing to look. Cabin air filter. This one gets forgotten a lot because the oil life monitor doesn't track it. Replace every 15 to 25,000 miles and check it once a year. Brake fluid. Every 2 years or 45,000 miles. If you tow a trailer or have trailer brakes, check the moisture content with a test strip once a year. Transmission. The 10-speed automatic paired with the EcoBoost is generally reliable, but if you tow regularly, follow the factory severe duty interval for transmission fluid changes, usually considerably shorter than the normal use interval. Transmission overheating under load is a quiet killer that most people never connect to engine problems, even though they're separate systems. Driving habits. Now we get to the part I said might be the most important, because no maintenance schedule can make up for bad driving habits. Short trips are enemy number one. If most of your driving consists of trips a few miles long, to the store, to work 5 minutes from home, your engine never reaches full operating temperature long enough to boil off the diluted fuel in the oil, and the cooling system and turbochargers never get to run in their optimal range. This is the main reason owners in colder climates who mostly drive in the city report more oil dilution issues than owners who mostly drive highway miles. If this is your driving pattern, compensate by taking a longer drive of at least 20 minutes once a week to get the engine up to full temperature, and shorten your oil change interval to the lower end of the range we mentioned earlier. Hard acceleration on a cold engine. Flooring it in the first 2 to 3 minutes after starting, before the oil has circulated and warmed up, is one of the fastest ways to wear out turbo bearings and piston rings. This is especially true in winter. Constantly towing near maximum capacity. The EcoBoost is an excellent towing engine thanks to the torque that turbocharging delivers at low RPM. But if you regularly tow close to the maximum rated capacity, the engine runs under constant high boost pressure and high exhaust gas temperatures. That's not inherently bad, the engine is designed for it, but it increases the need for stricter oil change intervals and regular cooling system checks, as already mentioned. Auto start-stop. The factory system that shuts the engine off at stoplights is useful for fuel economy, but on some vehicles it adds extra wear to the starter and battery over time. This isn't really an engine issue so much as an accessory system issue, but if you notice the starter cranking more slowly after tens of thousands of start-stop cycles, that's a normal consequence of this technology, not necessarily a failure. If this video helped you, drop a like and subscribe, and see you in the next one.